Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute here. Traditionally, for these webinars, everyone shows up like 1 minute after the start time. You know how it is. You get your notification. Then you're like, oh, shoot, I have to open Zoom. And then Zoom needs to, restart and update and all that. So we'll give everyone a little grace and we'll get started probably around 7:01 Eastern time.
As also is traditional, Jim and I are wearing nearly matching outfits.
All right, we'll give it just another minute or two for everyone to file in. I was giving one of these presentations at a high school last night, and there was a near disaster with the microphone. So I ended up just having to like shout in an auditorium. It was a near disaster because we were doing it hybrid. So it was a Zoom broadcast at the same time as a live presentation. And so we ended up having to just have me shout to the people in the room and then use a computer microphone instead of the room microphone for the Zoom recording. Fun times. You got to love high school IT departments and the various adventures that can come about as a result of them not being there at 7 p.m. Fun stuff. All right, we're going to jump into it now. Oh, sorry. What was your question, Tori?
PW.
Yeah, it was. All right, we're going to jump right into it now. Welcome, everyone, to our presentation on planning for a spring SAT or ACT. My name is Jim Wismer. I'm the director of Ivy Experience. I see from our participant list that most of you have spoken with me at some point or another about test prep plans for your student. And some of you have also spoken with Tori Burke, our assistant director and accommodations specialist. Tori is our master of schedules, so that would be the realm that many of you know Tori from. And tonight we're going to walk you through, of course, how to plan for a test now that we have these PSAT scores. Before we do, though, I think it's important to kind of contextualize what a test score does as part of an application. And so for that, I'm going to hand it over to Tori.
Hypothetically. Oh, okay. Sorry. So the most important thing on any application are grades and rigor. And so rigor just means like how hard your classes are, and obviously grades are just how well you're doing in those classes. The amount that the grades actually do matter really depends on the year. But each year has a really important part to play in that final application. So freshman year, we're just sort of building good habits. We're really learning how to study. We're making good relationships with our teachers that hopefully can last for a long time and also maybe even lead to a recommendation letter. Sophomore year, we're cleaning up those rough patches. So if you're maybe really struggling with math your freshman year, that's the time to get that like B minus, C plus to an A. And that might look like academic tutoring. And that will also look like your first ever PSAT that you take, well, for most students. Then we get to our junior year, which everybody kind of knows is, not everybody, but many people know is kind of the most important one for applications. Definitely also the most stressful. So that's really where you want to be putting your pedal to the metal, really getting it in there on the end zone. Then senior year, the start of your grades matter quite a bit. So basically until you send in your application, those grades are like taken into account for the decision. And then the end of year grades, the colleges will still see. For the vast majority of students, unless you actually like fail a class or something, you're just going to get a strongly worded letter. If you do poorly at the end of the year, if you do quite poorly, they might pull your failure acceptance, so that's really rare. Mostly they're just going to make you take some sort of remedial course. So regardless, you don't want to mess around your senior year, even if it is very tempting.
Now, when we talk about grades, it's important to track kind of the latest trends that we've seen in high school grades. And there's no doubt that relative to years ago, years in the past, that high school GPAs are inflated. I have data here from the University of Pittsburgh. It's the most up-to-date data about last year's freshman class. That's the most up-to-date data you can get. Colleges release data about their freshman classes, but it's always on a delay. So we'll get new data this spring, but this is the best we have right now. And it shows that the students at Pittsburgh's main campus in the city of Pittsburgh, over 70% of them have a GPA of 4.0 or greater. Now, this is a weighted GPA, which is why it can get over 4.0. But the point here is that parents, what you knew to be, a 4.0 GPA when you were in school, it's much different now. It's flatly, based on data, easier to get A's now than it was, parents, when you were in high school. And that's an important part of this conversation to have in mind, because at the same time as we're seeing this rise in high school GPAs, over the exact same time period, we're actually seeing declines in average ACT and SAT scores nationwide. So this is data from 2010 through 2021, but the trends do hold up based on more recent data through 2023. I just didn't have as clean of a screenshot to grab to show you all of that data together. But it shows that average ACT scores have actually declined, while high school GPA continues to climb and climb and climb. It's no accident that the big jump in high school GPAs occurred in the sort of pandemic gap between 2018 and 2020, where a lot of schools, froze GPAs, or for that final part of 2020, your grade could go up but not down. That's a policy a lot of high schools had. But the trends continued, right? And even rose the next year. And so in this era, when high school grades across the board are higher than ever, that's why standardized tests are so important. So in this world where so many colleges make it optional to submit your standardized testing, the question becomes, what is the point? Why do colleges want this as part of an application? And the main reason is simply that colleges use your test scores from the SAT and ACT to predict how successful you'll be at college. And they're predicting three very specific numbers for most students. They're looking at your predicted freshman year GPA, your retention rate, which is essentially, the percent chance that you stay at that university, and four-year graduation rate, the chance that you're going to graduate in 4 years and be a happy alum, and then hopefully donate back to the university, et cetera, et cetera. So the strongest statistical correlation historically has been with the GPA. These three metrics are best measured by a high school GPA. The second best single metric to try to determine them is a standardized test score from the SAT or ACT. And these two metrics together are more predictive than either one independently. Now, in this context, especially in post-pandemic times where GPAs are so strongly inflated, some colleges have come out and said that they are relying more on standardized testing than they did in the past. What we have here is the Dean of Admissions of Emory on the record saying that he doesn't trust high school GPAs as much as he used to, and is relying more on external standards like the SAT or ACT, like AP exams, which we'll also talk about in this presentation, to validate these performances in high school. Another important piece of the standardized testing puzzle is that it allows a college to compare a student with their local context. So with your high school transcript will travel something called a school profile. And that school profile is going to contain certain information about your high school, among which is the average SAT and or ACT scores from your high school. And so colleges can see how you're performing relative to peers of a similar background. Finally, it's important to remember that these test scores are part of a holistic review process. And what that means is that they are not the whole story. No one believes that you are a test score students or parents that your child is a test score, or that that test score is the single most important piece of information they'll ever get about them. That is not the case, but it is a valuable point in a holistic review.
So there are a couple of different ways that schools can use the standardized tests. So the most well-known one right now, and like is the most broadly used at the moment, is test optional. We oftentimes just abbreviate that to TO if that happens at any point during the presentation. That's what we're talking about. And that's being used right now by like most well-known universities and colleges. Some colleges are still test required. So this is mostly larger state schools in the Southeast, like University of Georgia and the Florida State system, but it's also some of the more elite schools like MIT and Georgetown. There's also kind of like a whole different situation going on in California, which is this test blind or score free thing, where this is all of the UCs and the Cal State system, where even if you send a score, they won't see it at all. And frankly, sending the score might just look bad because you've not paid attention to their guidelines. So yeah, Jim is about to talk about a lot of the different ways that test optional can be, but it is really important to know that some schools are on other ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, and if I could simplify, if you think of 100% of colleges, maybe 5% require tests, maybe 5% don't use them at all or strongly de-emphasize them. And then you have this 90% in the middle, and they're all test optional. The problem with that 90% in the middle is that they represent a spectrum. And so you have some colleges that are test optional, but what they're actually doing is admitting over 70% of their freshman class with test scores. It just says they're test optional. You have other schools that are test optional, but they're admitting fewer than 30% of their freshman class with test scores. So the term test optional, if you were to just Google, is so-and-so school test optional? If they're admitting over 90% of their students with test scores, the answer is still yes, because it's not 100%. If they're admitting fewer than 30% of their students with test scores, the answer to are they test optional is still yes. So test optional means different things at different universities. All test optional means is that you can choose to send the score or not. It does not, as a term, say anything about your likelihood of acceptance with or without a test score. So why would a college be test optional? In other words, why do these institutional policies differ, or why have so many colleges stayed with a test optional policy, given what I talked about with how useful test scores are to predict certain things? So test scores give colleges more flexibility in the students that they admit. We most commonly see this with a group of students that we call institutional priorities, which is a broad-ranging group of students. Institutional priorities would be certain students or categories of students that a college would want to admit for reasons other than their strict academics. An example would be that, the football team, they need to have a quarterback. The orchestra needs a French horn player. Right? Musicians and athletes are one of the kind of most easily understood institutional priorities. You could probably guess that at a school like, say, Penn State, the average test score for their football players is going to be a little bit lower than the average test score for the students who are getting in on academic merits. This would also cover first-generation students, can cover legacies at some schools that still prioritize that, can cover children of wealthy donors. Any students that would be preferred to be admitted for some special reason would fall into this category. The other thing is that some colleges do want to admit students for reasons other than strictly academics. There are colleges out there that really value creativity, and they care a lot more about the art portfolio that you submit as part of your application than your test score. So for them, they can say, hey, we don't want to put up this artificial barrier to letting in the most creative students for our art program, or the most skilled students in this technical skill for our art program. And so we are going to allow them to apply without test scores. So colleges are just given more flexibility to do as they wish. Another thing that's important to note here is the U.S. News and World Report ranking algorithm. So I'm assuming we're all familiar with the U.S. News and World Report top 100 colleges and college rankings. It's an algorithm. So someone's not there manually ranking colleges. They're feeding data into an algorithm that then ranks the colleges. They tweak kind of the weight of different factors, but that's it. In terms of factors, one of the most important factors is a college's acceptance rate. The acceptance rate of a college is just the number of students who are admitted divided by the number of students who apply. If you want to make a fraction smaller, you make the denominator bigger. That means that basically the more students that apply, the lower the acceptance rate, because colleges are not going to just build another dorm because they got more applications in most cases. So what that means is that test optional policies have been proven statistically to raise application numbers at a school. Students feel that they have a better chance when a school is test optional. If their score is maybe not up to the school standards, that may be true or not, given the case, but many more students will apply when a school is test optional. And so that means that they're lowering their acceptance rate. The other thing is that it allows schools to protect their average test score ranges. The average SAT or ACT score at a given college is one of the factors in the ranking algorithm as well. And most of you have seen, especially parents who have an older sibling that went through this process. The average test score ranges since colleges have gone test optional have gone way up because the bottom part of the score ranges has dropped off. Most of the students at the bottom are not submitting their scores. So this is all just kind of important context for why a college would go test optional. Now, when we talk about test optional, I like to sort of teach you how to read the tea leaves. So I've mentioned that a college can call itself test optional, but colleges can mean different things by that. And so I'd like to show you some data next to the wording on colleges' websites so that you can start to understand kind of what this landscape looks like. In Temple's policy here, Temple University, many of our students are in the Philadelphia area, so we like to use some local examples here. They say, if you feel that your test scores are not an accurate reflection of your academic ability, or you were not able to take the test, you do not have to apply with scores. That's a very welcoming way of saying, if you feel that you don't want to send the scores, then you should not send them. Well, Temple's telling the truth when they say that. Only 31% of their students submit scores. They're admitting 69% of their freshman class that are applying without test scores, right? And it's reflected in the wording on their website. University of Pittsburgh has a similar thing. They are 63% of freshmen, and this is Pittsburgh's main campus in Pittsburgh, that are submitting scores. And they say the University of Pittsburgh's decision to go test optional is to ensure that no student is denied the opportunity to be considered for admission. So they're not saying, if you don't feel like it, don't send your scores. They're saying, we want to make sure no one's denied the opportunity to be considered. You will still be considered if you apply without a test score. But that's a far cry from if you feel that your test scores are not an accurate reflection. And the percentage, it backs that up. So we can see that the wording of the policy on the website gives us some indication. Now, these wordings of policies on websites aren't perfectly aligned with what a college does, but it is quite nice when they are. Now, I have a much more extreme example. Duke University, they admit 93% of their freshmen with test scores. And what that means is that they're pretty much only admitting the institutional priority students without test scores. What do they say on their website? Buy a study guide, begin taking practice SAT and ACT tests. They sound like me. They're trying to sell you test prep. You know what I mean? We recommend that a student take an official SAT or ACT in the springtime of their junior year. And then, oh yeah, by the way, we're test optional. And so you can see how these things work. Often you'll get very honest wording on the website like this, not always. So it is worth kind of digging into what these percentages are at a given university. But the point is that, again, if you were to look at an aggregator of just like list out all the schools that are test optional, right? A list of all the schools that are test optional for the high school class of 2025. All three of these schools are going to be on it with no caveats provided at all. Temple, Pitt, and Duke clearly have a very different philosophy on using test scores in admissions and on how, quote unquote, real test optional is at their different universities.
So there's another kind of way that test optional schools get a little wonky with who actually needs to submit. So for example, Pepperdine is like as test optional as a school can be. So as you can see here, only 29% of freshmen submit test scores. However, if you want some specific scholarships, you do need to submit, even if you don't submit for your actual application. So this is their like highest scholarship, I'm pretty sure. So the Regent Scholar Program. And there are like a whole different like list of them. And on the next slide, I think we have Bama. Yeah. So Bama has just right out on their website, like you get this much money for this score and this GPA, and that's that. So actually quite a few of the large state schools in the South have very easily laid out rubrics like this. I would hazard a guess that more schools than are actually publishing them have rubrics like this, but it's really nice for the Southern schools because they just sort of tell you right away. This is for the out-of-state students, but these scholarships are actually even bigger for the in-state students. So if you know anybody that's looking in state and for Alabama in particular, the scholarships are crazy. It's very impressive.
If your student is applying to large Southern state schools and has committed to going to one, you definitely want to try to hunt something like this down if it's there, because they will actually take scores through the end of senior year. So that means like if you applied with the 28 ACT and you got in, great, $10,000. But if senior year you can get one more point, how does $5,000 a year for 4 years sound? So this is a kind of a dream scenario for us because it gives us the opportunity to save your family $20,000 by doing some test prep. Everybody wins. So these merit grids are super valuable. They're unfortunately rare, and a lot of schools, as Tori alluded to, are not super transparent about what they are, but when they're published on the site, they're a great opportunity. So definitely look into these, especially if you are a family that knows like we're going to need to be hunting for scholarships to pay for college. But everyone, whether you quote unquote need it or not, there could be tens of thousands of dollars on the table for you. So it's important to consider.
Yes, whether or not you need it, surely you would prefer to have the $100,000 rather than not have it. So yes. So also, this is the other kind of way that these test optional things are a little bit weird, is that even for schools that are test optional, so we saw that Pitt is sort of in the middle there, but also for Vanderbilt, you need to take the test, or in Pitt's case, take a placement exam in order to get into like the normal freshman English. And if you don't have an SAT test and you don't do all of that placement exam, you're going to have to take an additional composition course. Vanderbilt actually will not let you take a placement exam. You just have to take the test. If you apply and you don't have these numbers, so that's less than a 660 on the SAT reading, or less than a 30 on the ACT English. So in both of these cases,
with students, seniors in high school who were going to Vanderbilt, who after being admitted, this was years ago, realized that they needed the score. This was before they were test optional. So it was a student who got in with a score below these thresholds, but then realized like, wait a minute, I can get out of taking a course if I can just raise my score by 40 points. So obviously that's a worthwhile endeavor because you pay by the credit when it comes to college classes. So again, we're talking a lot of money in these cases.
So there's also some other exceptions. So for example, like I actually come from a homeschool background, like working with homeschool students. I wasn't personally homeschooled. And so I helped a lot of those students apply for college, and most colleges ultimately are test optional, but homeschool students do not apply for that because there needs to be some sort of additional outside regulation on like what did they actually learn during their homeschool experience.
As much as high school grades are a cultural practice that changed with the times and they mean something different than they did back then, mom's grades are even more heavily influenced by these kinds of things.
Yes. And then also certain majors are different. So like Elon, for example, is pretty test optional, but Elon nursing, absolutely not. You gotta have a score. Sort of similar. Auburn, you can apply without a test if you have a GPA over 3.6, but if you have a GPA below 3.6, that score is required. Colleges are also doing this kind of sneaky thing where they say they're test optional, but for example, Cornell has sort of admitted on the record to using something called an imputed score, which is basically as all of the like the bell curve, this half has fallen off. They're just sort of not assuming that if you don't submit, for example, I think at Cornell the average SAT score is around 34. ACT, I mean, obviously. They're not assuming that you got a 32 if you don't apply with a score. They're assuming you got like a 28 or a 27 or lower. So in that case, if you only got a 31 and you're like, oh God, I'm not going to apply with the score, it's better to just do that rather than hold it back and have them assume you did way worse than you actually did. So some people are definitely withholding those scores when it's not necessary. Like they actually did perfectly fine, basically.
Yep. And so the wisdom that we've heard passed around throughout this whole kind of test optional experiment that colleges have done over the past few years is that you should not submit your score if you're below that college's median. And especially in an age where there are colleges on record imputing scores and there are even more off record who are not admitting that they do it. It means that if you're a little bit below the college's median, or if you're between the 25th percentile and the 50th percentile, you should probably be sending that score. Now, everything's context dependent. There are going to be exceptions to that, but it is an important thing to remember. So what is the bottom line? We just kind of hit you over the head with a lot of information about test optional admissions policies and what they meant. And we were supposed to be talking about planning for a spring SAT or ACT. But it's really important that you understand how these things work when you're making your plan and deciding how much time and effort are we going to put into getting ready for one of these tests. A strong test score is still without a doubt an admissions asset, and that's true anywhere that's test optional. So you will increase your likelihood of acceptance by submitting a strong score to a college. What is strong is going to vary by the college. The more selective your college goals are, the more important it is for you to have that score. And that's because when you're applying to colleges that are very selective, and we define that as under a 15% acceptance rate, it means that you just need every factor in your favor that can possibly distinguish you from the applicant pool. University of Pittsburgh does not have an under 15% acceptance rate, and 70% of their students are applying with over a 4.0 weighted. So you can imagine that at the Ivy League schools and other hyper-selective schools, that we're seeing even better grades on average being accepted. And we once heard from a Penn admissions officer, this was years ago, but it still holds true. If Penn decided to just deny their entire freshman class and let in the next however many students, their average GPA and average standardized test scores wouldn't budge. It would not go down at all. So having that one more factor in your favor, it's not like grades and test scores are quote unquote enough to get you into the best schools in the country, but they are really important for acceptance of those schools. Having a strong score is going to help your options for college choice, and it's going to give you more options for merit scholarships, because there are schools that are, test required where you'll be able to apply. And then there are schools that are basically test required, like Duke, or that prefer test scores like the Pitts of the world, where you're going to be able to have a stronger application with the score. And then finally, it is absolutely worth saying that if obtaining a strong test score would require such a distracting amount of your time and effort, that it would take away from your ability to do well in your courses, that it would take away from your ability to participate in the extracurricular activities that are important to you. It would take away from your ability to, sleep well and be healthy. Then, of course, there are plenty of options out there for test optional schools. So we don't mean to imply that absolutely everyone, no matter what, needs to be investing a lot of time and money into test prep. That is not the case. There are students for whom it doesn't make sense, but we've seen this trend where a lot of students who could be working towards a score that would be an asset don't realize that the score that they could realistically achieve would be an asset. And that's what we're trying to kind of fight against with sharing this information.
So when you're trying to determine your SAT and ACT timeline, everything needs to be really dependent on who you are, student, or who your kid is, parents. It's really important that you're not saying, oh, well, my neighbor's kid took the test, so why is my kid not taking the test? well, you are in fact not your neighbor, and you do not have your neighbor's kid. So everybody is really
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes I'll have planning calls with families and they'll be like, but you worked with my neighbor and you told her this. And I say, well, I can't talk to you about what I told your neighbor, but I do very frequently tell different people different things based on their situation. That is the point of working with people one-on-one and trying to build out custom plans.
Yes. So in general, though, if you've got the Algebra 2 and geometry, which is the backbone of the tests on both exams, frankly, we are going to recommend that you take your first test in junior year. So there are kind of two timelines. Either you're on a fall timeline, or you're on a spring timeline. Also, I'm sorry if anybody's noticing, I'm having a major hiccup situation. It's very embarrassing. But and those two timelines are really dictated by the extracurricular or like your real life schedule, and also your mental health. So all things being equal, say we've got students that really don't want to be prepping during when they're in concert band, totally reasonable. Let's prep before or after. We've got students that don't want to prep in season. All right, let's prep outside of season. Also, if your mental health is just not at a place where you're feeling super pumped about, well, not really pumped, no one's like, woo, but if you're not feeling like this is going to be a good plan for you to prep while you're also taking all your AP classes and stuff, all right, let's try to make sure that we're really avoiding those May test dates. So please, like, especially on the phone, like when we're having a planning call, if you're working with us or with anybody else, you want to be really clear on what those extra factors are so that we can be making a really good recommendation for you. Outside of just, okay, you've taken Algebra 2, well, then obviously you should be testing. Yeah.
So what I have up here is the calendar of test dates each year. So any parents of younger students here that aren't quite in the process yet, the tests are offered in the same months each year. Now with the SAT, our spring test dates for our current juniors in the call here who are using their PSAT to get started are March, May, and June. If you're prepping for the March test date, then you want to get started, if not now, then definitely right away in the new year. And the idea would be that you prep up to that March test date. And it's a nice test date because it allows you to avoid that sort of end of junior year rush. The students who might consider avoiding that test date would be, you know, if you are a winter track and field athlete or a basketball player, a wrestler, you know, if winter is a specifically challenging time, if your school's spring musical is very early in the spring or something like that, then you want to make sure that you're, you know, just not trying to layer too much into one time period. We do have athletes who work in season every year. It's possible to do it. It's just more challenging. The May test date, as Tori alluded to, is it overlaps with the test dates for the AP exams. So May 6th is the date of the May SAT, and the AP exams start right after that. So that's important to keep in mind. June can overlap with final exam time, depending on your school schedule. It's typically the first weekend in June, so it's not always going to overlap with your schedule, but that's kind of what to consider. ACT for our spring dates, we have February, April, June, and July. I would recommend, all other things equal, aiming to take February and April as far as the ACT goes. And the main reason for that is that you get 2 tries before that end of junior year rush where you're preparing for AP exams or IB exams and final exams, final papers, final projects, all coming due at the same time. The July ACT date can be nice because you have a whole month after the school year lets out where you'd be able to hit it very hard. It's typically mid-July. So if you finish with school in mid-June, then you have a good kind of runway where you can take your prep really seriously and focus on it. The dates I have highlighted in yellow are the last dates that are accepted for early action or early decision deadlines senior year. So in an ideal world, you don't need these test dates, but I do like to put it out there. If you're applying for the regular deadlines, then either December test date will work for you. So that's kind of the lay of the land as far as the different test dates are concerned.
So something that we hear constantly, so me and Jim both answer the phone, and I probably hear this more than half of my calls, is which test has the easiest dates? And people have all kinds of conspiracy theories about which one's going to be. Okay, well, this one has more seniors, this one has more sophomores. I don't even know. All kinds of crazy stuff. The answer is this is not a thing. And anybody that tells you otherwise, especially in the test prep world, is probably unscrupulous and is trying to figure out when is best for them to have you prepping, not when is best for you to have you prepping. These curves are predictive. So they're based on what has actually happened already, and they're not based on what will happen on test day. So the curve is decided beforehand. There are easier and harder curves, but they occur totally randomly throughout the year. And trust me, if this changes, we will be the first to know, and we will certainly tell you. So everybody's always worried about this, and we always just like to include that on this slide because people are really worried about taking spring dates for this reason. It's just not true. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, the curves will vary, and tests will vary in difficulty.
Sure.
Tests and curves will vary themselves, and often even more importantly, the test will vary in terms of how frequently specific topics show up on a given day, and it can sort of agree or disagree with you personally. In other words, maybe there's a passage in the reading section that's on something you're actually really interested in. What a rare treat to have a standardized test reading passage that you actually dig into and like personally. That would be a big advantage. Whereas if it's something that makes your eyes glaze over, you know, you're going to fight through it and take it seriously because it's an important test, but that's going to be a lot harder for you. So the individual variation component of this comes into play too. There's really no way to predict when the easier or harder tests come.
And also, everybody always thinks, like, depending on who it is, like individual person, like I'll have a kid come to me the same exact day that another one came to me saying it was the hardest one they ever took. Another one's like, oh my God, there were no matrices on that test. It was a breeze. So yeah, it really does depend on, like, did that math topic come up that you didn't want or not?
Yeah. So let's talk about the two different test options, SAT and ACT, and how you would make an informed decision of which one to pursue. So our first option is the digital SAT, the new digital SAT, which will be offered for the first time in March. Those students, your PSAT was in this exact same format, though the scoring is a little different. So the way the digital SAT works now is that you have a reading and writing section and a math section, each out of 800. So that scoring component hasn't changed. But now you have two modules that make up each of those sections, and the test is adaptive. More about that on the next slide. The biggest challenges a student's going to face on the digital SAT, and this is relative to the ACT, is one, that there are limited annotation tools on the digital SAT. There are annotation tools on the test, and they are quite useful. There are a lot of things we can teach you to do with those annotation tools. But at the same time, ACT is on a piece of paper and you have a pencil. You could do whatever you want to annotate the ACT. You cannot do whatever you want to annotate the SAT. You have to play within their constraints and what the technology will actually allow you to do. The verbal questions on the digital SAT are a little bit more challenging than their ACT counterparts. In general, there's a trade-off on the SAT and ACT between difficulty level and time. So if you were to look at SAT questions in a vacuum and ACT questions in a vacuum, most students would probably rate the SAT questions as more difficult. But with the ACT's time limit, that adds a different wrinkle. So the SAT, more time, but for more challenging questions, especially in the verbal section. The verbal section will also include things like poetry and texts from the 18 and 1700s sometimes. So obviously those are much more difficult to read. The ACT doesn't really go before the 20th century and even rarely outside of the 21st century with the dates of their texts. Now, the adaptive nature of the test is also a challenge. And I say this because it's sort of something that can get inside students' heads. So the way that the adaptive test works is that you start in a module 1 of standard difficulty. So every student is going to receive a module 1 at the same difficulty level. They're not all going to receive the same module 1. So your test questions can be different from the test questions of the student next to you, but everyone's module 1's the same difficulty level. Based on your performance in module 1, you either test into a more difficult module 2 or a less difficult module 2, and that's going to impact where you will eventually be scoring. Because you'll only have access to the higher end of the range of scores from the harder module 2 and a lower end of the eventual scores from the easier module 2. So there is overlap between the scores that you can get from each module 2. So if you do very poorly in the harder module 2, then you could score lower than you would if you do very, very well in the high module or the easier module 2. So that's just something to keep in mind in terms of, the scores. The adaptive nature of the test kind of messes with students' heads. And I've heard from students and parents, like, how are you teaching students to strategize around the fact that it's adaptive? Which to us is kind of a funny question, because the way you get into the harder module 2 where you can score higher is to get more questions right. So we're going to keep doing what we've always done and teach your students how to get more questions right, which seems delightfully straightforward, because it is. The truth is that if you get half of the questions wrong on the first half of the linear paper SAT, you're still not going to be able to score in the 700s. So getting a lot of questions wrong in the first half of the test already had this effect on scores. And so it's a little bit of a distinction without a difference, this adaptive nature of the test. There is a strategy component to it that can come into play, in the sense that if you test into that harder module 2, well, then you're getting the same amount of time for module 1 and module 2. And so it could be harder for you to finish module 2 on time. And that's something you're going to have to work towards, because if you're in the lower module 2, you finish on time, but probably get a lower score. So you still want to be in the harder module 2, but so timing strategy can come into play, just in terms of it being different between the two modules, but you still want to be in the harder module 2 at the end of the day. So this is something that's going to mess with students' heads more than it will actually impact how they should be taking the test. That's why I list it as a challenge for the SAT.
So the ACT has also 4 sections, but they are all graded separately, unlike the SAT, which sort of combines the 2 maths and the English and reading into individual scores. The scoring is also averaged rather than additive, which means that colleges wind up sort of looking at that cumulative score a little more heavily than sometimes they might for the SAT. It also can help. That's like a good and a bad for different kinds of students, because if you have like a much lower one, like one section much lower, that can be really helpful if it's an average, just because of the way math works. In terms of timing, our big challenges, as Jim was kind of alluding to earlier, you got more questions in fewer minutes. Well, I guess now you don't have fewer minutes, but your average amount of minutes per question is significantly lower on the ACT. The test is also longer, so it is pretty tiring. Also, the SAT has a very limited range of types of questions they're going to ask and topics they're going to ask you, whereas the ACT kind of rolls through them. So as we were kind of talking about earlier with, oh, this test was harder for this specific person, that's going to happen a lot less for the SAT, because they're just going to be a fewer range of questions. But that means you can really roll high on the ACT. Like, okay, there was no questions I didn't like on this test. So that can be like actually a big challenge and also a huge advantage. It really just depends on how lucky you get.
I think the challenge aspect of it comes into play more for the students who are going for very, very, very strong scores, especially math scores in like the 33 to 36 range, where you don't have the option of getting problems wrong. So you need to be prepared for a broader range of topics on the ACT than you would on the SAT. That doesn't necessarily mean that that would push you one way or the other. It's just the challenge you're going to have to face on one or the other. So with all that said, how do we actually use the PSAT to make a plan? So one thing that's important to note about PSAT scores is that it's an initial benchmark. It is not the score you're applying to college with. In a perfect world, it is the score that you get, and in a couple months, we look back at it and we say, wow, you did this many points better than your PSAT score. Look at how much you've improved. That's the point of a PSAT score, right? So we've seen a lot of students be discouraged by PSAT scores. I think that's especially true because on the digital SAT, there's a bit of a disconnect between the perceived difficulty of the questions and the actual score. And part of that is because if you test into the easier module 2, then you actually did get an easier test than a paper PSAT would be, which would have a standardized difficulty throughout the whole thing. But that is actually reflective of a lower ending score. So on the digital SAT, there is more of a kind of gap sometimes in how a student felt taking it and how they actually performed. So the best thing to do from here is to try an ACT diagnostic test. I see some people in the chat here have already heeded my advice to take an ACT diagnostic test. Great job to all of you. But the idea is not necessarily that you're going to take the ACT or going to take the SAT. You just need to be able to make the decision between the two. You're going to pursue the test that is actually more likely to give you better results. Tori mentioned that one of the most common questions we get is, what test date has the easiest or hardest curve? The other question we get is, are you sure that colleges accept the ACT equally to the SAT? And the answer is an unequivocal yes. Colleges absolutely accept the ACT just as well as the SAT. It's just a matter, students, of which one that you can actually perform better in. So we offer free remote SAT and ACT diagnostic testing. We will send it out to everyone who is registered for this webinar. And you've probably gotten it in an email from us before if you're here. But based on how your student does, we'll compare that with their PSAT score report, give our recommendation, and then we'd offer a one-on-one planning call so that we can actually set the timeline for how to get going on prep from here.
Okay. So this is where we start talking about what the actual timeline should look like. So for diagnostics. So for juniors, we want you to do this as soon as you possibly can. And this should be before you begin test prep. Although at this point, for some students, you might just have an idea of which one you prefer. And you can let us know. For sophomores, we want all of you taking this by the end of the school year. If you're planning on prepping over the summer. And that's especially important for those students that have taken both Algebra 2 and Geometry. You can also wait especially if you have not taken Algebra 2 and Geometry, you can also wait until your PSAT results come back if you plan on prepping during your junior year. We always get the odd freshman who's like really raring to go. It's like, I want to do it now. Don't do that. Wait until your sophomore year. You're going to be okay. I promise the test's not going anywhere. You're going to be fine. Yeah. So another question that we get all the time is, can I just take both tests? And the answer is, I mean, you can. If the spirit moves you, you can take both exams. But there's no real reason to do that. Certainly, focus your prep on one exam. Prep for one test will help you on the other tests because they are ultimately standardized exams that are testing the same topics for the most part. But we have found that students perform significantly better when their focus isn't split between the two tests, because it sort of starts to mess with their brains. So not with their brains, with their heads is what I meant. So it's much better to just focus your prep on one and then take both if that's what you really would like to do. The people that it makes the most sense for to take both tests are really high scorers. So that's the 1500 plus and like the 32, 33 plus students who just sort of need a good roll of the dice that day. Like, oh, there were no matrices on this test. I got a 36 as opposed to a 35. So most other students, it doesn't make a ton of sense for the most part. So here are some links. This is going to be sent out to everybody, so you'll be able to actually click these and not just dangling them in front of you tantalizingly. Registering for both of these tests is really important, and you want to do it early, especially depending on your region. It might be a little harder to register, so it's always better to try to do it soon. Just enter the zip code to see your local options. There are two extremely important checkboxes when you register. So the first of these is whether or not you want optional testing information, optional marketing information sent to your house or to your email. So some students love this. It's great. You find out about schools you never would have heard of. My little sister, for example, wound up at Juniata College. We grew up in New Hampshire. She never would have heard of this if we haven't gotten an email. So changed her life. That was great for Alicia. Some people are like, this is way too many emails. I'm going crazy. I don't know what to do. So it's really up to you. That one's not as like earth-shatteringly important. It's just you do want to make sure that you think about it before you do it. The second one is much more important, which is it's going to say, do you want the option of sending this to 4 colleges? The answer is you do not want that. It is not worth the money. Absolutely do not do this. You might walk into the room and you might have a sniffer, which is our the test prep world's name for anybody that's just sniffling throughout the whole test and you get really distracted. You might have a fire drill. There's all kinds of stuff that could happen. You might get sick and throw up. Don't have that sent without knowing what's going to happen. Yeah, and it's in the end, it's not that much money and it's only 4 colleges you get anyway. So just that's a box to be left unchecked under almost all circumstances.
Oh.
So, we have some links here about testing accommodations. So, we have a blog post that Jim and I wrote just sort of about like the whole process. And you're also always welcome to book a call with me. This link will go straight to my Calendly, so you can like make a link, book a call with me at any time. A lot of students really incorrectly assume that if you have accommodations, you should be just automatically going test optional. I'm here to tell you that's absolutely not the case. I'm a student that had testing accommodations. I also work every single day with lots of students that have testing accommodations. It's always worth at least trying or at least talking about it to see like what we can help you with. Any student can be successful on these tests is my general feeling on the matter.
Now, when it comes to preparing for these tests, a couple things that you should keep in mind, and this will be whether you're preparing with us, with another company, or on your own. You want to make sure you're doing practice in authentic testing conditions. That means you're taking fully timed tests and that you're taking them all at once with a 10-minute break for a snack or the bathroom or both between the middle 2 sections. When you're prepping, you want to make sure you're targeting the areas you actually need to work on. So doing everything A to Z is not essential for most students. It's a matter of figuring out what on this test do you actually need to improve in and focusing your time and energy there. And the last thing I'd say is be consistent. It will do a lot more for you if you do a little bit over a longer period of time than if you try to just cram with a bunch of time right before your test date. And so again, these are things that we'd recommend no matter how you're choosing to prepare for the test, with us or without us. I really recommend that you stick to these 3 points. In terms of waiting for the scores from the test, so the scores for the SAT are always going to be released on the second Friday after your test. And so you'll get them on that day, and then you'll share them with us, and we'll take a victory lap or make a plan for what comes next. On the ACT, similar deal. The scores start to be released on the second Tuesday after your test, but they can be released up to 6 weeks after that date. Students who qualify for extended time on the tests are usually going to receive them on the later end of that. And when I say that, I don't mean the students with national extended time. For anyone in the chat that this is relevant to, I mean students who test especially over multiple days, where often you're not even finished with the test yet as of the normal score release date. So you could expect those scores in later, of course.
So super scoring is just a term that means that you can pick and choose the best individual section score from different test dates, and then combine them to get your optimal wonderful score at the very end. So you can then, it's really lovely that they do, like a lot of schools do this, not all of them, but more than half of the well-known colleges do, because you can then prep for like a specific section for retakes. You do always have to take the full length test. I've been getting a lot of questions, especially lately, about if you can just take one section. That's not currently something that's offered, and not something that's probably going to be offered in at least the medium or near future. But it is still nice that you can take, that you can really be prepping like really hard for, say, like a math section. If you're scoring right now like 33, 30, 33, 33, get that math score up. We'll take a bunch of math sections. You'll be fine. It is also really important to like give us your list as soon as you have it, in terms of like is your school going to super score or not, so that we can be giving you accurate advice.
Yeah, so super scoring is great because you can really target one section when you retake the test, and that means it factors into your prep plan quite a bit.
Yes.
All right. Okay, so what about AP scores? How do they factor in here? So the primary function of AP scores historically has been for college credit or placement. So if you take AP biology, your college may choose to grant credit for biology 101 if you score potentially a 3, 4, or 5, which are considered the passing scores on an AP exam. Some colleges might only give you credit if you score a 5, or only if it's a 4 or 5, but they can give credit for anything between a 3 and a 5. But these policies are going to vary quite a bit school to school. Some colleges are not going to offer credit for any APs. Other colleges offer credit for almost all of them. Some of them have nuanced policies. So a common thing that we'll see is that certain engineering programs won't let you use AP calculus credit because they want you to take calculus. There's more than one way to teach calculus for anyone who doesn't know that. Sorry about that. They want you to take calculus presented in the way that is going to lead into their calculus 2. And by the way, that's also the way that they use calculus in their, physics courses. And so for that reason, sometimes they might accept a calculus credit from a history major, but not accept a calculus credit from a student who's studying engineering. Because for the history major, you're saying, okay, you've done advanced enough math in high school and did well enough on this test that we don't need to require a general education math requirement from you. But for the engineer, actually, we need to teach you calculus in a very particular way so that you're ready for the rest of this curriculum. So that's a pretty common thing. But the AP scores are gaining importance in college admissions, where you're, like we saw from the Dean of Admissions at Emory, the AP scores are one more external validation of your high school GPA. So this is especially true if you're applying without SAT or ACT scores. Applying test optional usually just refers to SAT or ACT, but you can actually then submit AP scores. And if you have really strong AP scores, you can say, hey, I did really well in this, and this content area on a standardized test that's held to a normed statistical standard. And that gives that external validation for students who are applying without SAT or ACT. The exams are in the early part of May. And I would say make sure you're being honest with yourself about how much prep you need. So that means 2 things. One, look at how you're actually scoring on your tests. And students, I don't mean retests if that's something your teacher offers. I mean the first time you take the test, which is the true measure of how well you know the material. And then you should also consider how well is your teacher actually mimicking the AP format in their assignments. So if you're taking AP US history and your teacher is assigning DBQ questions and you've gotten a lot of practice with them, great. If you're taking AP US history and you don't know what acronym I just used, you probably need to start preparing for the exam a little sooner than otherwise. And so you want to consider both of those things. How well am I doing in the class? How closely does the class track the exam content? Those are your 2 main considerations. We're actually going to be doing a webinar on AP exams in February. We'll be announcing our spring webinar schedule at the end of December, so stay tuned for that. Thank you all so much for joining. We are able to hang around as long as people have questions, so please drop your questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom, and then we can answer them one by one. I'm going to kick it off with a question that we get very, very commonly on webinars like this, which is how many times should I take the SAT or ACT? We deliberately don't comment on this in the body of the presentation because it is a very individual concept. If your only goal is to, for example, apply to Penn State main campus, and the first time you take the test, you score 1,500, the answer is you should take it once. You are what you need to do. That would be if you're not considering the Schreier Honors College, by the way. If you're considering the Schreier Honors College, then actually you want that score to be as high as possible. But so it's goal dependent relative to how you score. And it's also relative to kind of how you did on your practice test leading up to that test. In other words, if you score way better than any of your practice tests, that means you got really lucky. And then that's a good thing. But it also means that if you take the test again, you're not likely to replicate that performance. And you'd have to do a lot of work to even expect to replicate that performance. That might be a case where you hang it up after 1. Most of our students will test 2 or 3 times total. And a lot of that comes into most colleges, or most students have colleges on their list that super score. So that's a really good idea. But I would say 2 to 3 is within the realm of normal. There are reasons to test more than that. The two most common would be, one, you're going to the University of Alabama or a similar school that has a merit grid, and you know, I'm going to get $20,000 for one more ACT point. Keep testing till you get it, right? That's a very straightforward $20,000 if you get it, $0 if you don't. You want to make sure that you actually get that score. A similar situation is if you're a recruited athlete and your coach tells you, you need to get this score to get through admissions. Yeah. So in both of those cases, you have a very, very desirable objective that is linked to an exact test score. In most of college admissions, we want to get it higher to increase the probability. And that's something we want to continue to do, but it's uncertain. In the case of those merit grids and athletic recruiting, there's no uncertainty. It's if you get it, you're good. If you don't, you're not. And so it can make sense to kind of repeatedly test until it happens in that case. Otherwise, it's a more nuanced conversation of, okay, when do we have to leave well enough alone? Every student will hit a point of diminishing returns on these tests. It's just a matter of where that is for a given student and what the situation is surrounding it. All right. That's all the material we had prepared for today. So if you have any questions for me or for Tori, you can reach us at the normal Ivy Experience communication channels. We are the two people who answer the phone, respond to the text to our office numbers, respond to emails to info@myivyexperience.com. So we're happy to help you. If you want to set up individual meetings to talk about your student's specific situation, let us know. We'll be sending out a copy of the slides and the diagnostic test to everyone who's in attendance tonight. So thank you all for joining. Have a great night. We finished right on time. Go us. All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.